not overly distracting, so I just...
Yes, it's fine. I think we can work.
Okay. I think we can start if it's all right with you.
Sure.
Thank you again for agreeing to participate in this conversation, which was kind of a magical, spontaneous thing. Sharmistha Mohanty just came to Chile, and the translator, Antonio Díaz Oliva, let me know. And so I thought we could do something with the Católica. And then Janani, I had also been talking with Janani Ambikathy to do some kind of event. And I thought, why not have a conversation all together about India and poetic writing? And why not also invite a professor from the Católica itself, Elisa Silva, who's sitting right here next to me. So it's all come together quite well. And again, I'm grateful for your participation. I'm going to read a couple of short biographies just to give a little bit of context of who you are, which I've just taken from online. So Sharmistha Mohanty is the author of 3 works of fiction. Book 1, New Life and 5 Movements in Praise, which is the book that just came out in Spanish translation in Chile. She has also translated a selection of Rabindranath Tagore's prose works, Broken Nest and Other Stories. Currently, I'm not sure if still currently, she's working on a book of poems, I Make New, the Song Born of Old, as well as a book of prose texts. She had participated in the Kochi Biennale with a poetry and sound installation, and she founded the online literary journal Almost.
Oops, she froze.
Jessica's screen.
How do I put this one in silence?
Now we can hear you, Jessica.
Just keep that there. Sorry about that. We've got Janani Ambikathy, who's a poet, critic, and translator. Her recent pamphlet, If Not Theirs, was published by Veer 2. Her poems and essays have appeared in many journals, including Lena Turner, Firmament, Data Bleed, The Rialto, Visual Verse, Modernism, Modernity, Modern Poetry and Translation, and Hopscotch. She reviews books for Harriet Books, and she lives in London. And recently she was also named the editor of Modern Poetry and Translation. I think it's come back now. Great. So this is the wonderful thing about doing international conversations. We have these technical problems that we then resolve. So yeah, thank you, Sharmistha, and thank you, Janani. And now I'm going to read the biography of Elisa Silva. She has a degree in history from the Católica here in Chile, also a master in liberal arts from the University of Pennsylvania, a doctorate in history also from the Católica, and she investigates and teaches the contemporary history of India and its representations in Chile. So we've got a good group here. So I think Janani might just be reconnecting. In the meantime, we can have a start with Sharmistha. I know that you just recently came to Chile to present your book and its translation. Can you speak a little bit about, well, first of all, what that book is mainly about, and then also your experience in Chile itself presenting it?
I don't really like talking about what my books are about. I think I don't feel very close to that word about, Jessica, because I think when you're not working with conventional narrative forms, a book is not really about something, and to me, it comes from something and then opens up towards something. So the word about is, I think, too restricted and closed for me. Five movements in praise is not easy to describe. It has a sort of a central traveler narrator who moves through different landscapes and situations. And there are five what I call movements in the book, not chapters, but movements, because I really see them as movements, not in a musical sense, but in the sense of an arc beginning and completing, perhaps. And so this narrator traveler changes. It can be a man, it can be a woman, uh, depending on the context. And the traveler travels through five very different landscapes, which reveal different things about this soil, about himself or herself. That's the best way I can describe the book, really. And Chile, I think the lecture, it wasn't really a lecture. I mainly read from my prose from this book, and I read a little from my poetry. The Gods Came afterwards. And then I finished up with a very brief talk about my work. So that's what I did. And I also at the end had a conversation with the poet Rodrigo Rojas Bolo, and I thought that was a very interesting conversation. And to me, I have to say, the most fascinating thing was that when Raul Zurita did the introduction, he kept mentioning one Rulfo. I couldn't understand what he was saying because it wasn't being interpreted simultaneously. And later, when I asked him, he made the connection that he felt that what Rulfo does is bring the past into the present, that's one of his main achievements. And his comparison was that I too am attempting to do something like that. I mean, for me, Rulfo is a great writer, and I'm not placing myself next to Rulfo at all. But this thread continued because Rodrigo said the same thing, where he felt that apparently India and South America are very far from each other, but he felt that we shared certain rituals of death or certain attitudes to death. And I think that's where the Rulfo connection came in that Raul brought at the beginning. For me, I interpret that as perhaps both your and our connections to death are similar in the sense that we don't see death as an end point, that death is a very permeable thing. People return from past lives, and having died and living people cross over. So maybe that is what Rodrigo and Raul saw as somewhat similar.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting, and we can get more into maybe the mythological aspects of that conversation around death, and I guess the resurrection from the earth and things like that. But first, let me just briefly ask. Let me turn to Janani and Elisa. Janani, you also in your work, if not theirs, like Sharmistha, maybe you're taking an approach that subverts traditional narrative structures, or you're not interested in a work that's about something, as we were just saying. Sharmistha was saying she doesn't like to define her work as about something, but rather, talk more about the formal structures. How do you see your work as playing with those formal structures, or how do you see it working with the sort of technique of the prose?
I was actually going to say the exact same thing. That I haven't cracked the problem of aboutness. I don't think I even know how to write about something without kind of wandering away. So I think I write in the same way that I read, which is somewhat tangentially and laterally. And if I'm reading a piece, I have enough academic training to think out an argument or formulate an argument about it. But I'm much more interested in kind of how the writer approaches the central problem in the piece. And that problem need not be external. The problem can be about the process of their own thinking in a way. The thinking can be the problem. And how do you arrive somewhere? How far do you go? Where else do you go? How do you then approach the heart of the text and also approach it somewhat hesitatingly? And I think this is more or less defines my method. And it's always hard to kind of formulate a sort of functional criticism of your own work, but maybe I can think about it in terms of influences. I'm quite influenced by historians, philosophers, architects like Lorraine Daston, T.J. Clark, Carlo Ginzburg, and I think all of these thinkers sort of have this capacity to think across time, but also across place. And they widen that moment of thinking and writing. And I'd like to imagine that I sort of write within that expansive vision. So in a way, maybe if I have to write about a wolf, then I'd have to start thinking about triangles or, something like that.
Because your work engages with both Tamil philosophy and mathematical logic in a way. Just a quick note, if everybody mutes their sound while they're not talking, maybe it will have a better audio quality. We're getting a feedback. Yeah, okay. But right, your work engages with both Tamil philosophy and also mathematical logic, or its ways of thinking are sort of interested in these if I'm not a mathematician, it is if then structures, or kind of playing with these logical games. What do you think about that?
Well, at least in terms of the Tamil influence, I don't know. I mean, again, it's not intentional. I do translate from Old Tamil and contemporary Tamil, and to put it very, very sort of simply, at least Old Tamil poetics follows this kind of landscape grammar. One might call it landscape grammar, where the landscape is continuous with an interiority. It's not just how you feel in a place, but also how a place can engender a feeling. So it's kind of dialectic that you might feel certain things in a certain place, but the place will evoke certain senses. So that kind of relationship is codified and then reproduced within poetic meter. So I'm interested in that kind of contradiction between lush, tropical prose in a way, and a sort of sharpness and rigor and determination and form. So maybe my work tries to play with that sort of tension. Maybe it tries to. I couldn't be sure, but maybe that's an influence. But in terms of mathematics, I think I'm just I use the mathematical register. I don't know if I know mathematical logic enough to engage with it, but the register is certainly interesting. And there's a kind of absolute freedom in mathematics where you can declare anything, posit anything without having to care about the material reality. And you can live in a beautiful building and not have to build the building. So I think I like that kind of I like that kind of freedom. Maybe I'm envious of it. Maybe I'm just reproducing something that isn't mathematics at all.
Got my volume. Lisa, I'm not sure if you would like to say something also about your experience teaching Indian history in Chile.
Well, for me, it's different because I work with facts, and teaching here in Chile. I was muted. Yeah. You have to. No? There. Are you listening now? Yeah, okay. So I was saying that overall, it has been a very good experience to teach Indian history and finally Indian culture here in Chile, because students are very interested in learning about a culture that is quite unknown to them. And in that sense, I think that the unknown is what attracts them most. Their interest is broad. But I think the ways of life and customs, Indian customs, are very different to them, and they want to know more about the, I don't know, arranged marriages, the caste system, etc. And regarding literature, I teach a course in which we analyze different Indian phenomena of, I don't know, the reality of women, the difference between North and South, technological advances, etc., through novels. So in that sense, I try to introduce them to a different way of learning about India, not just the facts, also cultural products, I will say. In another courses, I asked them to analyze some aspects of a novel or a film about India. So it's finally a way to introduce them in a different culture, in a different way of see the world, and yeah. But I think here we don't have many opportunities to learn about India, so it's a little space to do something about it.
Thank you. Out of curiosity, which are the novels that you going, but I'll turn myself off again.
Yeah, some of the modern classics like A Suitable Boy, Ladies Couple, The White Tiger, which is the other one? So one of John Palahiri, I don't know the names in English, but it's La Hondonada in Spanish. Yeah, and The House of Blue Mangoes, I think. But I'm changing them all the semesters.
Yeah, thank you, Elisa. No, it's interesting because as Elisa is just saying, I think in Chile, there's not too much knowledge about India in general. So I think having, contemporary writers come is very important for kind of expanding the stereotypes, etc. Which is why Sharmistha's visit last week or 2 weeks ago, I think was an important thing for audiences here. I know that you were just talking about the kind of links between this part of the world and maybe India that could be developed, and you mentioned the rituals surrounding death and maybe that certain mythological ideas. And reading your latest book, 5 Movements in Praise, that drew my attention. The kind of engagement with mythology, like you have certain reflections on Krishna or on like the figure of the woman in the past and the contemporary woman, which kind of inform all of the chapters. I don't know if you'd like to discuss your relationship with, I guess, Hindu mythology in that case, but mythology in general, and how you bring that into your literary poetic work. You can unmute the.
Yeah, I can be heard now. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Yeah, I just wanted to say that 5 Movements in Praise was not my last work. It was actually published a few years ago. And I guess for whatever reason, Antonio and the people in Chile who translated it liked that particular book. So it's been a while. It's been a while since I wrote it. My connection with mythology is, I am very, very involved with the past of this civilization, because I don't think that you can be a product of the Indian subcontinent and not carry this very vast arc of time and of space, literally, because the land is so large. And what elements of it you carry is obviously up to you. And for me, the ancient art forms, the ancient texts, the myths, the figures from the myths speak a great deal, and they have energized me and my own creativity in many, many ways, because for me, the past is, drawing the past forward. It's not nostalgia and looking backward and saying that was a golden age, but it's to see what is the energy I myself can draw. How can the past inform and strengthen the force of our own creativity in different fields, because the fact is, we had great power in our creativities and in everything, in all the art forms and in philosophy. And as Janani is here, I mean, she knows even in mathematics and science and all of that. So I wanted to set one of the movements in 5 Movements in Praise inside a miniature painting. And the reason being, medieval miniature painting is something that has really attracted me. I think it has a particular worldview, which is a little complex to get into here. But I am drawn to that worldview very much. And I thought, I was looking at these paintings repeatedly. And, in Indian miniature painting, you don't have perspective. In fact, in Indian painting, you have no perspective at all in any kind of the older Indian painting forms. So everything is on the same plane. And to me, that is speaking a philosophical truth as this civilization understood it at a certain point in time. And that is, again, is something I feel very close to. So when I was looking and studying these medieval miniature paintings, and the ones that are in this book are mainly from the hills in the north, and they're called Pahari miniatures. So as I was working, I thought, well, why not have the traveler actually travel into one of these paintings, into the dark forest of one of these paintings, and see what happens. And that's all I had in mind. I mean, the rest was discovery as I went along. And I also wanted to put it next to the reality of these paintings being in museums, most of them being in museums in Europe or America, which is, also kind of a strange thing. So, yeah, that was, for me, the impulse with which I'm engaging with mythology. I'm engaging much more with the paintings than the mythology, actually. If you read it, you'll see that. So the figure of Krishna as God and what that represents interests me less than the worldview of the paintings, than the philosophy of the paintings, because I think philosophy, to me, can be deeper and can have a far wider ground than mythology, In a way, that's a contradiction in terms, because I know that mythology is very wide. So this is a very individual thing that I'm saying. I mean, in India, we're surrounded by mythology all the time. So it can also be a little overdone, and at sometimes you want to escape those figurative things, because all the mythological figures actually come from philosophical sources. They're representations of philosophical things, which are kind of forgotten today.
Yeah, thank you. I think that comes through. And in fact, that also drew my attention. And it's something I liked a lot about the book. When you discuss the paintings, or when you discuss these, I guess, mythological figures, such as Krishna, you kind of skip over the figure in the foreground, like hop right over him into the background, and focus more on the hills and the natural landscape. It's kind of like bracketing off the traditional figures of mythology to talk about the worldview behind them or around them. And your book itself is divided into these chapters of town, forest, city, caves, and landscapes, which are, obviously these kind of natural categories, or engage with the landscape, not necessarily the humans. So I don't know if you also would like to discuss your relationship with nature and sort of the landscape in that sense, also in this book or in general in your more recent works.
I think that for me, the biographical and the non-biographical are very much on the same plane. So I don't like to foreground the human being and let everything else be backdrop. I want to engage with landscape or light or architecture in the same way that I engage with a human being or a consciousness, because I wouldn't call the people in my book characters. I'm not interested in psychology. I'm much more interested in their consciousness, which is a far more open, vast, and unlimited thing, So that's one thing. And obviously, if I think of the human and the non-human, in India, we sort of, if you go back to the Upanishads and you look at how they're placing the human and the non-human, they're basically saying that everything, every element you see in the universe is limited, but they are connected to each other. And because of their limitations, they suffer. So every element, every being, every animal suffers because of their own finitude, so to speak. So for me, that's very important, to take the natural world or the man-made world together, and have them exist and interact together, and not make a differentiation in hierarchy between a tree and a person sitting below the tree.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. I think Elisa would like to ask a question. I don't know if to both or to Sharmistha or to
Sharmistha.
Okay.
You previously mentioned Rulfo, right? Besides him, do you have another Latin American authors or literary trends do you think you have some connection to, or you are particularly interested in?
I have read a lot of Latin American literature, and my first way of getting to know Chile was through your poets. And I was really thrilled to be, standing in this land of the poets that I had admired: Gabriela Mistral, Pablo Neruda, Nicanor Parra, later, of course, Raul Zurita, also Maria Luisa Bombal, who's more a prose writer, whom I absolutely love. And when I read her, I realized the connection between her and someone like Rulfo, how she would have, probably inspired even Marquez and many of those writers. I love many of the Argentinian writers, the contemporary ones, one of whom was a dear friend of mine, Sergio Shafek, who died a few years ago. Um, and yes, so I mean, many that I admire. Octavio Paz, Valerie Meher, Pura Lopez Colom. I mean, I've read a lot of Latin American poets and writers. Yeah. And I think it's very fine writing, and it's where I would look to very often actually get, get a sense of possibility. I would not want to imitate them because they come from a very different reality than mine. But, just there are writers who open up things for you, and the Latin American writers have certainly done that for me.
I think that's a good way to transition into the next question I was going to ask. Maybe we can start with Janani, but I'd also like to ask it to Sharmistha, because both of you have experience editing international literary magazines, which have, quite a good reputation and have published a lot of authors from around the world, including Latin America. How do you see in this kind of global landscape of writing this idea of the region, or how do you think of the idea of the Latin American writer, the Indian writer, in this context of a very global kind of literary atmosphere? Do you still think that we can make these divisions, or in what ways, where everybody's kind of reading everybody, do you see there being a place still for locality or connection with more local culture? Maybe Janani. I'd also like to know about Janani's Latin American literary influences, if she'd like to talk about that. Yeah.
Well, I've been obsessively reading Amanda Berenger. I'm such a fan. I could just never stop reading. I recently reviewed The Lady of Elgin. Yeah, I'm really such a big fan of her work. I also like La Vitale, and I discovered Shefek through Almost Island. And Mario Lebrero, I just started reading one of his novels. He's irritating and funny. But I think my allegiance mainly lies with the Latin American female poets. Well, kind of about
Yeah, no. No, we can't hear her again.
I can hear the fan quite clearly, but I don't think I can hear
I don't
you.
even know if it's the okay now. Is it gone?
Now we can hear you. Yes.
Now we can hear you again. Okay.
Start again. I was going to say that just writing in English, writing and mainly translating into English can give you the sense of maybe occupying only a contemporary time and place, the place that you are in and this contemporary time, which maybe because I read way too many old manuscripts, I think that kind of is like a kind of false idea of the time that you occupy, because we do read literatures from the past, we read literatures from other regions, and the way old manuscripts are dated, there's an internal time and there's an external time. The internal time follows its own story and logic, and the external time is a scientific chronology. But the internal time of contemporary literature, I think, spans quite a few centuries and quite a few other places. And I know this conceptually, but when I am editing a literary magazine, when I do read works from other times and other places, it gives me actual, tangible access to these times and these places. And it makes me feel as if I am part of multiple timelines rather than an extremely narrow idea of where I am and what I'm writing. It allows me to escape the pressures of those things. And also writing is a kind of isolating experience. And we're all the better for it. But editing other people's work gives me access to their minds, and maybe thinking about a more collective idea of what translation can be. What are we doing? I mean, there are all these questions which we can maybe think about more collectively, and it gives me access to that collectivity, to be a part of that collectivity, to even maybe formulate that collectivity in some way. So I think that's one of the perks of editing a literary magazine. And in terms of locality, I do think there is a place for the local and the regional, and I don't quite like the global mishmash of we're all writing the same. Like I said, I mean, contemporaneity, just that word has the way of sort of uniformizing everything and ironing out all the nuances and the ideas, and I think it's important to sort of remain interested in the regional and the local and the specific histories and the specific time, and I think this is really the job of the literary criticism to do that. So that's another thing, editing a literary magazine, to be able to focus on literary criticism that can support and provide the conceptual, socio-political foundation for the literary work, so that it's not just a poem out of Chile, but we understand the time and the context of when this poem was written and why. So I think that is also something that I'm able to articulate through working in a magazine, much more than as a critic or a translator.
Yeah, thank you. I often have that experience reading literary magazines that have lots of different kinds of collaborations. That it's almost a disorientating or hallucinatory experience, because you've got all these different realities and timelines coming into sort of contact at the same time, and you know, it's something that in your daily life you don't necessarily experience, and in the pages of a magazine you get that experience. So, and I also like the idea of there being different sort of historical times existing at the same moment. I know you're doing a lot of interesting work with Tamil manuscripts and which have these kinds of different ideas of history and time, and maybe the contemporary India that you're existing in, it kind of creates a different alternative construction. I don't know. But let me ask that same question to Sharmistha. How do you see your work as the editor of a literary magazine in that sense? Like, how do you see your kind of local presence coming into conversation with all of these international writers, or what do you see as that idea of locality doing in that kind of global literary context, where it's easier than ever to have contact with Chilean writers, or whatever place might be?
Well, first I just want to say that I really liked what Janani said, and I agree with her completely on many of the things she spoke of. And I think for me, Almost Island, when I began it, I was very sure that it was, it had one foot on the subcontinent and the other foot outside it, so to speak. So I never wanted to lose a sense of local in order to become universal, because I don't believe in that. I think, what have I learned? I mean, that's such a vast question, because we've been around now for 16 years, and sometimes I think the greatest thing I've had is just sheer wonder at the beauty of literature that comes out from every corner of this world, So you have the long, endless sentences of Laszlo Krasznahorkai, the Hungarian writer, and then you have maybe the very jagged lyricism of somebody like Beidou. Then you have a totally different register from young poets coming out of Zimbabwe, who we did an issue on and a program with, and how they sound. So it's, for me, again, opening up immense possibilities, because I grew, I think, as a writer throughout my life by absorbing from the entire world, not just India. And I think that would be true maybe for most contemporary writers. I mean, who would not be reading outside, work from the outside? I asked Raul this question I asked him who have been the poets most important for him, were they Chilean poets or the entire continent as a whole? And he first said, well, the entire continent as a whole, but then from everywhere in bad Spanish translation. And I think that's true of every writer and poet who has or wants to have great reach, because your influences are so many and so different. And I guess both Janani and me, I mean, I studied in the States, she studied in England. I mean, all those also change you and make you what you are. So the poets and the writers who have most built me as a writer may not even be Indian, and they may not even be writing in the English language, because I read a lot more in translation than I do in English. For whatever reason, I'm just more fond of the European work or the Latin American or the Chinese, So, yeah, I mean, I'm rambling a bit, but I'm coming back to your point about the local. I believe intensely in the local, because even if you have an influence which comes from a very different part of the world, it still means that you are learning from that person. But what you give to your own work has to be always from the ground up, right? So it has to be local, and then it has to be opening up to other people who've taught you how to do what you do, perhaps, So I think both are very, very important.
Yeah, I think we've agreed that the local is important even within this international sort of landscape, and I think it's interesting to think about how to keep those levels working and engaging. I wrote this question, and I'm just going to read it because I don't think I can reformulate it. In what ways might poetic writing create new paths into the history of India and its diaspora, and new possibilities for writing about it or around it, avoiding a single pure homogenizing narrative? I don't know if you'd like to talk about, I don't know, maybe the ways in which your own poetic work is in dialogue with history in this sense. I know we've kind of touched on that, but given that the theme of this chat was supposed to be is refractions of the ancient, I guess the question is sort of asking about what refractions you see your personal body of work as engaging in dialogue with kind of the grander history.
Janani, would you
Janani,
like?
you want to take that? How does your work reflect history?
I didn't expect your questions to be this simple, Jessica.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can ask you, your favorite food or something if you prefer.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe just I'll speak from my local practitioner point of view, and I think I'm always kind of maybe one way to answer this question is to think about the anxieties I'm responding to, writerly anxieties that I'm responding to. And I think maybe those have more validity and truthfulness than any kind of critical formulation about my own work. I think I have this kind of tension between being an insider and an outsider. I'm translating these old Tamil manuscripts, and yes, I was born and raised in Tamil Nadu, and of course I speak the language and read the language, and yet my PhD was on a French poet, and I'm not a trained Indologist. I don't have an Indologist view of these ancient texts, so I kind of struggle with this idea that if I'm approaching these texts as an insider, as I claim to be an insider to these texts, then does that not make me someone who's just a little bit parochial and narrow-minded? You think that you are an insider to a culture and therefore you know more about it, or that I pride myself in being interested in foreign cultures and reading foreign literature. So this kind of going back to my own ancient past, which is actually quite foreign, as foreign to me as foreign to anyone else, I guess. I struggle with what do I do about somehow being in that place and being of that language, being continuous with that history, if one can claim so. So I guess that's one way to think about the refraction, going back to ancient. But at the same time, I also want to look at this work not as an endologist, but as a poet. So, you know, as a poet who's able to hear something in the language, not as someone who knows Tamil. So I'm hoping that sort of resolves this insider-outsider feeling with one's own ancient past. And the other thing, I guess, in my poetry and not in my translation, also I had this worry that I was born and raised in India, and I'm not a diaspora person, but then now I live in England, and I'm constantly anxious about what do people read in my work? Do they see other traditions? Do they see Tamil? Do they not see it? And, you know, damned if they see it, damned if they don't see it. So I have these kind of existential anxieties about what other tradition is being reflective, and am I doing it intentionally or not intentionally? So so I wonder if that kind of anxiety also informs the presence or the absence of other traditions that I'm writing through, like Tamil. Would I name things? Would I use, I mean, definitely decides things like, would I use a proper noun? And living in London, if I use a proper noun, which is India related, what kind of, you know, I wish I didn't have these anxieties, but I do have these anxieties. So I guess that's one way to engage with a culture that I belong to, don't live as part of any, you know. I don't know if that answers more or less.
Yeah, and I think that answers something. I think that's a good answer. I like the idea that we all kind of exist with our own anxieties, and that actually fuels the kind of creative work also in a way, and creates these kinds of you know, beautiful, productive moments also. That dialogue with history as not being a comfortable thing, but an uncomfortable thing, I think is interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know if Sharmistha wanted to also answer that very small question that we posed.
Again, I think what Janani is actually bringing up is that there is no kind of neat answer to this question, perhaps, because you're always struggling with something as you're working. And I think the best way for me to answer this is not necessarily through 5 movements in praise, but through my book of poems, The Gods Came Afterwards, which is, I don't know how to describe it, but it could be called prayer poems, though that's not the description I would like to use. Doesn't have to be prayer, but they are poems of invocation and addressing something abstract in the universe. So now the thing is that I wrote these poems in English. I write in English, and while writing them, you know, my struggle was to try and purge the language of its Englishness, as it were, you know, and to purge all kind of religious words, because I wanted to work with subcontinental philosophical traditions, not by naming them necessarily, but by filtering them through my own sight in whatever way I could. And it would not work if I couldn't make the English transparent enough for those ideas to be absorbed into the language. So it's like you're trying to bend a certain language to what it doesn't normally express. And there's an awkwardness that comes from that. And I saw that, but I let that awkwardness be most of the time so that it becomes part of the poetry. So that's, you know, just an example of how I would deal with, you know, being with my own kind of dualities, as it were, you know, of writing in English, but wanting to write the subcontinent or wanting to write certain things very closely related to the subcontinent. So, and these are questions I think that, you know, for me are there all the time. They never go away. And each new work, you deal with it differently. You approach it differently.
Yeah, I find it very interesting that both of you are in agreement with the idea that that language or the texture of language bears all these traces of these engagements or struggles with the past, and that the yeah, I guess the transparency or the opacity of the language also has to do with that. There are kind of maybe more transparent or less transparent moments of consciousness, and those kind of take form in the prose also. And I like the idea of bending one language to another. And I guess we're all, you know, translation fans, so maybe this is also something that we enjoy. But this idea of bending a language toward ideas that aren't necessarily ingrained in that language. In fact, we were just discussing Rao Zurita. I just read some quote by him that said, the surface of a language reflects he said it more beautifully than this, but the symphony of all the past takes form in the texture of the language in the present, or something like that, making some kind of musical metaphor about how language kind of bears all of the presence of what came before, and its tensions also. And on that note, maybe I can ask Elisa also, since you're teaching in Spanish, how do you feel the presence of language in that sense? Do you find teaching Indian history in Spanish has tensions also?
I'm not sure. Since it's I teach like in an introductory level, I think it's not a problem. Here we have all our courses in Spanish. It's not even in English, so I don't teach in any local language. So I think it's more difficult to translate some customs, some ways to live. So I try to use local examples that are related to what happens there, and to make them to see that it's not that different as they could think in the beginning. Well, they are always trying to look India as the other, so I try to make closer India and their customs, their, I don't know, philosophy closer to our examples. Yeah, and in terms of translation for you, do you think that your poetry, your books lost something in their translation? I read your book, Sharmistha, and it has a lot of notes to explain who Krishna is, or who is I don't know, a Dalit. Do you think in that sense your work lost something in translation as the movie?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Yeah, so I was saying, I don't know if I can actually answer that, because I don't know any Spanish, so I haven't read, you know, anything of the translation. And no matter which culture you're translating, you would have to have those footnotes. I mean, perhaps English doesn't, because it kind of rules the world, so it doesn't need those footnotes. But otherwise, you would need them. I mean, if I'm reading Neruda, very often, I will not know what are the figures that he's referring to, you know, the historical figures or the incidents that he's referring to, and I'll have to look them up. So I think that's true of translation always, you know, and maybe just a little more for this book of mine, because it does go into a lot of subcontinental rituals and figures and landscapes and architecture, all of which have very specific names and functions. So I think you would have to tell me if you think what kind of experience it was to read the book in Spanish.
For me, I don't know if you agree with it, but it was a really good one. I could identify the traveler around a personal search and around different places and times. And I think the translation was really good. I had both the English and Spanish version and compared them, and I think it's a pretty good. It's really good translated. I don't know what you think, Jessica.
You're muted.
So I said, I have to admit, I read the book in English because I received both versions, but I have the Spanish also. And I know Antonio is quite a good writer in Spanish. I've read his novels in Spanish, so it's interesting for me to think about this act of translation as two good writers coming into conversation also. Antonio's got quite a poetic, lyrical style himself as a novelist. Actually, I've translated some of his works. We're all kind of connected here. But it's interesting that, as a translator, he can apply his own experience as a writer to, making certain decisions. And I have this idea that the poetic translators are also, they need to be writers themselves, at least have that sensibility. So even if they don't publish their work, like have the sense of making certain choices or have the reasoning behind it. And I have complete confidence in his work, so I know that the translation was good in that sense. It's interesting also, this question of footnotes, because how far to explain another culture or let it kind of explain itself through the context is always a sort of question when you can make different choices there as a translator, and that's not to do with the poetry of the prose itself, but something else. And he might have chosen to put more footnotes, where somebody else might have put fewer, but everything is, I think all translation choices are valid. And I think it's come through quite clearly from what Elisa was saying just now, that in Chile there's not necessarily very much knowledge of what a Dalit is, who Krishna was, etc. So maybe that is necessary, to kind of bring that to an audience that's not an academic specialist audience, but somebody who just wants to read a beautiful book.
That's right.
Yeah. I think soon we're going to be reaching the hour, but just to sort of close this, I wanted to ask, I guess, all of you, what you're working on now, or how do you see your current projects as engaging with these themes we've been discussing of history and language? Bring it to the present. Janani?
Well, I'm working on a book of poems. I'm also working on trying to write a nonfiction book about this particular Tamil anthology, which was possibly compiled in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. Ramanujan is probably the most famous proponent of one of the anthologies. I'm working on a sister anthologies where the lines are much longer, it's more complicated. And I want to write a kind of poet's approach to these texts, not just translating the poems, but decoding these poems and thinking through them, kind of close reading, and also thinking about the architecture, the archaeology, and other components that surround the manuscript. So yes, I'm sort of working on this book and a book of poems, and I'm sort of toying around with the idea of translating a Tamil modernist, but I'm not sure how far I've got with that, but it's to be seen.
Sharmistha, what are you working on now?
Well, I too am working on a book of poems, and it's very hard. And, writing, unlike a lot of other things, doesn't get any easier as you grow older or as you have more books. So I'm taking it very slow, and we'll see where it goes. It'll definitely take me another couple of years, I think. And I'm also working on a book of essays, some of which I've already written earlier. Essays which are not, they're nonfiction, they're not about literature. But I am working also on a long essay in this book about some of the great poets that I have had the opportunity to meet and be friends with and be close to. Because there's something I feel, and it might sound too innocent to others, but I believe it, which is that many of these great poets that I've met and known are truly very radiant beings, and their poetry comes from that place, and they are radiant beings who've walked through unspeakable suffering very often. And I think that, I don't know, that that suffering is something they've made into a glow on their own lives. And we live in a world of name and fame, but it's always the wrong things that get the name and fame. And I just wanted to write an essay talking about the people who are real, and the people who've had real experiences, in order then to write the poetry which is comes out great. So that's one of the things I'm working on.
I find that idea of the radiant being beautiful. Yeah, I look forward to reading both of your books when they when they eventually come out. I also like the idea that we're all on sort of different timelines. There's no rush, no urgency, sort of letting the things sediment as they need to. And Elisa, I don't know if you have a manuscript you're working on also, or
Yeah, collaborating with some works that are being editing in Mexico. One about Latin American travelers or diplomats and what they thought about India. And the other one is about women and India, Latin American women and India. And in that one, I wrote a chapter about Elisa Serrana, a Chilean writer, and she has a book called Chilena Casada Sin Profesión, Chilean Married Without Profession, that has a long part of the history happened in India. So I wrote a chapter on her view of India in the first years of the independence of Indian independence in the 50s and 60s.
And what
great.
about
So
you?
about all kinds of projects on the burner. Yeah, thank you. On that note, I think we can come to a close, but thank you again for your time and for presenting your work, your views, your philosophies, your anti-narrative. I think we're all against the about somehow. The kind of more anarchical or labyrinthine ways into writing, I think are interesting. And I look forward to reading what comes out of all of this. Thank you.
And thank you very much. Been thinking about them for a long time.
Thank you, Jessica, for organizing this, and I think it turned out to be a very, very wonderful conversation. Thank you, Elisa. Thank you, Janani. Janani, I'll be in touch with you. A lot of what you're talking about and your nonfiction book, I'm like incredibly interested in, so I'll be in touch.
Same. Let's email. Yeah.
Thank you
Bye.
both.
Bye.
Thank you, Jessica. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.